Well, hello, folks. Welcome along to the first live stream that we've done on this channel. And I'm pretty happy to say that today I'm joined by Fitzroy Sterling. He's been part of a few firsts in my life. Fitz, thanks for coming on board.
It's my pleasure, my friend. Great to be back with you.
All right. Today we are going to get into something that you and I feel very close to, trial by jury. Of course, you and I talk a great deal about Magna Carta 1215. We'll go into it another show about why Magna Carta 1215 is still the current and only constitution viable for us or any other Commonwealth nation. Today, though, we're going to talk about trial by jury. Now, it was stolen from us, I think, is about the best way of describing it. But I've got a little PowerPoint. If I start that up, maybe we can, go through it and you can talk us through trial by jury if you would be involved in that, mate.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really raring to go, so let's give it a shot.
All right, so to begin with, we'll get up page 1. Trial by jury, a criminal law, a civil law, and a corporate law. So we're going to go through those 3 examples today. And obviously, people will be familiar with the current system, and there is not a great deal of justice, I think people would agree, in the current system. Fitz, this rectifies that, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So the bottom line is that you cannot have the very people that we put or we elect into our service being in charge of what is deemed law. And so the current system we have now has a judge or a magistrate sitting and presiding over that which is law. The thing about that is they are actually employed by the government and they're very lucratively remunerated for that position. So what are the chances they're actually going to be really thinking about that which is required for us and our liberties to be upheld when it's their employer that they are duty bound to serve? The two are in diametric opposition to one another.
So I guess before we can really understand trial by jury, we need to understand that it is nothing like the current jury system. So people that sit as jurors in a trial by jury need to have particular understandings of, well, not so much the common law, but natural law, isn't it?
Correct. So the way you would, if you were to be a jury member, just before we get into the jury, it's probably better that we actually start with the convener, the sheriff, and the bailiff, really, because they're the ones who hold it all together. So a convener, sheriff, and bailiff, they are actually elected by the people, and they would be elected by the fact that the community has strong confidence in their understanding of natural law and their understanding of the laws of the land. And when I say the laws of the land, I don't mean that which government creates. I mean the 4 pillars which you've got here up on the screen. They are the laws of every land, right? Because that's what we intuitively understand. Our consciousness intuitively understands that if we are to live in peaceful, harmonious coexistence, those 4 tenets must be upheld at all times. As soon as there's a breach in any one or all of those, then we have chaos and violence. So we all intuitively know that. And so those people we elect into those positions, the convener, which the closest thing you have today to a convener is a judge, but they're nothing alike.
Yep.
The sheriff and the bailiff, they would all be elected into that position. And once they have that strong knowledge of those 4 tenets plus natural law, so the laws of nature by which we're all bound, which we don't get to choose, and we just accept that that's the conditions, the preset conditions that come with being on this planet, then those 3 are responsible in some capacity to elect a jury member. Now, a jury member, to be elected, there's actual requirements. Like you cannot have any sort of mental health illnesses. You can't have an interest in the case. You can't really have a criminal past. There's certain things that require you before you can even be thought of as a jury member.
Which aren't dissimilar to the rules in place for today's juries.
Correct, yes. So that's what they've taken all that from. So the juries we have today are taken all from the tenets of trial by jury, except they're obviously twisted and used for the control of people as opposed to the liberty of people.
Yeah, they've actually removed key powers from the jury so that the jury doesn't need to consider them. The court decides those matters.
Yes, so in a trial by jury, the jury has power to decide all matters to do with the case. So that's not just the case itself, it's the admissibility of evidence, whether there's an intent of the accused. They need to establish whether there was malicious intent of the accused. They get to hand down the sentencing as well as the verdict. And they also, obviously, whether there was a breach in law or not. So they're doing the whole thing. All the convener does, because they have a really strong knowledge of natural law and the law of the land, they're just educating the jury on how the procedure works. That's it.
Sure.
They have no involvement in their actual decisions. So that's the difference. And if you look at today, that's nothing like what we have. And also the jury, it's a unanimous decision. So if there's one member that says not guilty, the verdict is not guilty, even if the other 11 members say guilty. So it has to be unanimous. So that's the big difference right there. And so anyway, so the jury would then be educated by these people who actually have that knowledge. So that would be the convener's role, to educate them on how natural law works and how they are to judge by conscience, not by opinion. So they're to use their conscience, put themselves in the shoes of the accused, to understand the accused in an intimate way. They need to put themselves in their position and have their experience. So that's a real soulful journey that they're actually, and spiritual journey that they undertake. It's much bigger than just deciding on whether something's a crime or not. It's actually really looking into the accused as if it's their life that they're having. So it's quite a deep look in.
So this is something from a lived experience, is what you're talking about. They're to draw on their lived experiences rather than what the court tells them the parameters are that they're allowed to draw upon. Would that be a fair way of describing it?
Yes, like they've got to draw on how they live their life, because one of the accused is generally going to be someone that lives amongst them. Because generally you need, the way it was meant to be structured was, you need to have some kind of knowledge of the accused. It can't just be some total stranger you nothing of. You need to know something about them, what the integrity level's like, because otherwise how do you judge someone you know nothing about? So there has to be some knowledge of the individual that's being brought before the court. So it can't just be random people that have never met, or know anything of them. So it's a real deep understanding, because you are judging your neighbor, and you got to think, if you're judging your neighbor, do you really want to put a sentence out that could come back your way if you were ever the one that was brought before the jury? So that's kind of the premise that they're running on. That's the real true system of equity. That whole understanding that natural law is you get back what you put out, right? So is that what life we want to live? Do we just want to have people accused just because we feel like it? Or do we really want to, preserve the quality of each other's lives? At the
moment, there's a lot of gavel banging that goes on in a court. The bloke who dresses in the robe and the big wig, sits on the big chair up behind the big desk, gets to have all the power. Not necessarily all the power, maybe the supreme power in the court, but the two or three or pack of lawyers on either side working for both the prosecution and the defence are also working for the same corporation the judge is. We never believe for a second that they're working for you under the current system. Now, under trial by jury, I think, as you've explained, the judge is replaced by the convener, but the convener doesn't take the position of judge. He's more a guide, an educator, and to answer specifics at law. Would that be a fair way of saying that? And I'd like to say hi to Silver Bullet for tuning in, our first online viewer. Thanks, mate. G'day. Is that a fair way of describing it?
Yeah, and also they actually have the power to decide if the case has no merit as well. So that's the other thing. But they can never do anything prosecutorial. That's not their role. It's only if they can't see any merit in the case, then they can dismiss it too. So they have that role.
So what you're saying is the sheriff in this instance may have cause to bring an accused before the court, but before that can happen, or before the jury, before that can happen, the sheriff needs to present that evidence to a convener who then decides on the validity of the charge. Is that right?
Yeah, something to that effect, yes. Because it has to be a decision made whether it's worth, convening all the people together on if there's enough evidence. Because you're not just going to waste people's time. Someone needs to make that call. And because they were elected by the people, because of their knowledge of natural law and the law of the land, well, then there's a confidence that individual, that convener, has enough common sense to understand the difference between what's worth the court's time, and that's the jury's time, and what's not, right? Because we are putting some kind of confidence in them that they have a high level of integrity. So it's because we elect them, right? It's not just some guy that's elected by government. We do.
Yes. So they have a responsibility not just to the court, but to the community that put them in that position. And they would be a learned person, somebody who is not necessarily, and probably definitely not previously involved in the Roman legal system that we currently operate under.
Yes, absolutely. Like, this is nothing to do with that mind control construct that they invented, the legal system. That's just there to treat us as slaves. This is about our liberties that belong to all of us and the preservation of that as the highest priority. Because that's the first tenet of common law, is that an innocent man or woman must remain free. That's the highest priority.
So it really does become the lost onus, I think. Guilty until, well, innocent until proven guilty has turned now into guilty until proven innocent. Trial by jury would return something even better than that, wouldn't it? The prosecutorial case really has to go through two tests. The first test to even make it into the court, the second test then in front of a jury. Yes,
correct. So that's like a two-tiered system. So the validity has to be there first, and someone needs to assess that, and that's their role.
Under trial by jury, we would be removing what is essentially now known as the Department of Public Prosecutions, if you like, the government prosecutorial arm of the legal system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they currently decide what gets prosecuted and what doesn't, and that's why a whole heap of government officials, bureaucrats, and ministers don't get prosecuted to the full extent of the law. In fact, they escape it most of the time, and only in the most heinous of cases do they even front anything. And then those charges have been loopholed down to practically nothing. Is that a fair assessment of the current system?
That's right on the money. Because, like I said, if you've got a government employee deciding on matters of what is law, do you really think they're going to prosecute their boss? I mean, it's just, it's right there in your face.
Yeah, and of course we haven't spoken here. It sort of relates to the introduction of Magna Carta 1215, by and for the people. But we are in control in this. It's not a government organisation. We didn't create government so that it could rule over us. And this trial by jury is the way that we exercise that control over government and society at large, but particularly over government.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, that's a given. Like, you can't have that which we created being in charge of us. That just stands in the face of what the purpose of we creating something to serve us goes, and why it was created. So it has to be us at all times deciding on our own liberties, because they affect us. So if we've created a body that's meant to be there for our equity, well, we need to have a way by which we can ensure that equity remains. And so it can't be left in the hands of the thing we created. It will never work out for us. And
now, yeah, absolutely. So you've mentioned equity now a few times. Let's define equity in the sense that we're speaking about. Before we get into the criminal trial, I'm going to test you with a few basics. So define equity in the context of which we're speaking. Can you please?
Yes. So equity means that it's about each and every one of us having the same quality of life as our neighbor. So it's not like we're equal, because we are not born equal, right? Some people are taller, some are shorter, some are faster, some are slower, some understand maths easier, some understand English, some are better out in the wild, some have physical attributes, others don't. So we are not equal. Yet we all require a level of support in the places where we're not equal to get to that level of quality that those who have, natural endowment that don't need that support. So it's about making sure that we can preserve a quality of life that's equal to our neighbor. If you can understand the difference between equality and equity, that's a really good way to look at it. Another way that I've had explained to me is, imagine there's three boys and they've come to watch a football match, and they're three different heights. There's one who's taller than the fence, there's one who's eye level at the fence, and there's one whose eye level is below the fence. So equity means that the shortest one gets a big box to stand on so they can see above the fence like the tallest one. The one who's in the middle just gets a smaller box, just enough to clear the fence so he can stand with his eyes above the fence. And the tallest one doesn't get anything. So you see there was support handed at different levels to each one of those two boys, where the third one got nothing. Now, if we were to look at it as equality, well, yeah, it's not equal, because they all didn't get a box to stand over the same height. But the actual quality of the outcome is now what we call an equitable outcome. They can all see the game equally. So I hope that sort of makes sense as to what equity means.
Absolutely. A great definition of the context in which we speak. All right, let's get into a criminal trial. So I've done up a few basic things. A fella has come on board my property. He's taken a boat with a trailer. The whole thing's valued at $45,000. He broke into my house to do it, broke down the front fence, kicked open a shed door, broke the roller door getting the boat out. He not only destroyed the shed on the way out, but when he got it to a boat ramp, he offloaded it and ran into a pontoon, holed it, and sunk the pontoon. When the police turned up, he assaulted them, obviously resisted arrest before thrown into the paddy wagon, and turns up in front of a trial by jury. Where would you like me to start? Do I need to plead his case?
Yeah, so obviously there was going to be someone that would be elected, or like a power of attorney would be granted to, let's say, the accused. If they were not confident to present their own defense, they would find someone who would be in that role. So if we look at what lawyers are today, it'd be sort of someone who does that kind of same work, except they're not paid, on a case-by-case basis.
Yep.
They're not, because there's no venal motive if they're being paid by a case-by-case basis. So they would obviously be contracted in some kind of way by the defense, and the same with the who's doing the prosecuting. They would have someone they would choose for that, and they could switch, right? These people could sometimes be acting for the prosecutor, or sometimes acting for the accused, and so they could choose that, or they could present for themselves. That's a choice they have. And so then how it works is that the accused obviously needs to face all the charges that are brought before the jury. Now, before that, the jury has already decided on what's admissible and what's not. So they've already decided what's admissible as evidence and what isn't. And so now that evidence gets presented by the aggrieved, which would be you, for example. Yep. And, obviously that's all shown and it can be validated, etc. So whether it's pictures of all the damage that's been caused, the police report, if there was one of those, and then it's the turn of the accused now to plead their case as to, what was going on for them. Now, part of what they would want to be talking about was maybe, there's things we don't know. Maybe they had like a big debt they needed to pay.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So there was an inequity in something that happened in their life that they were trying to sort out in a real desperate moment. So the jury is sitting there imagining, well, what would it be like if I had imagine there's like, I don't know, some really urgent medical costs, and I'm just being, a bit out there now, that I needed to pay.
That's a very genuine point, yes.
And I didn't know how to do it, and I was really desperate. So I'm like, oh, this guy's got a bit of money, you know what I mean? I might just grab that and he won't miss it. Like these could be some things that could come up in your mind, and because he's so panicked, and maybe his conscience got the better of him, he ended up smashing the boat, right? And then he didn't even get what he was after. So let's say if that comes out, right, then the jury's imagining themselves, if that was me, what would I do? If I was in a desperate situation, if I had a child that really needed some medical treatment, and I didn't have a way to get money, would I be desperate too?
Yeah. Because
it's quite critical. So we need to establish like the history of why someone would do something. And now let's say if that was the case, now the jury, they would still judge the action as guilty, but not so much the man or the woman who did the act as having malicious intent, because that's the point. The point is, was there malice to cause you harm in their action? And if they can't establish that, and it only takes one jury member not to be able to establish that, then they don't get penalized like a criminal. What would happen is there would still be what would you call compensation granted to the aggrieved, but it would come out of like a sovereign wealth fund that we all pitch into for moments where there isn't criminal intent, where there isn't premeditated, it wasn't a premeditated event where they were thinking, oh yeah, I really want to, destroy this guy, right? If that can't be established,
or I'm a career thief and this is what I do, which is a whole different intent, obviously.
Yes. And so if this was just a one-off freaky thing that's, something we all fall on hard times, like we just have to look around the country, what's happening now. And that, desperate times call for desperate measures, as they say. So the jury is making sure that the, if it was established that there was no premeditated malicious intent, that they're not unfairly penalise the accused. They're not penalised unfairly, because then we're not living in a system of equity, because we're punishing them. Because it's not something they go about making a habit of. So this could have been a one-off thing. We want to restore both people's integrity, right? So maybe there's a way that if this member, the one who was the accused, could get his medical needs or the needs of his family met, then we've got equity now.
Throw you a wrinkle. The accused is a tradie, an accomplished builder with, contacts in all facets of the trade. He comes to court, is contrite, pleads his case, as you've suggested, with extenuating circumstances, and makes an offer to me as the aggrieved to rebuild my garage, to rebuild my fence, and not so much pay me damages, but make sure that I'm not. It doesn't cost me to replace what he broke. Is that an equitable solution? The court might.
Well, it also means something to do with your boat as well that was destroyed. That would need to be covered too if that was going to be on offer. But yes, that would be something that would be allowed for you, to decide as well. Like if you're happy with that, because you're the one who's been put out, right? And only you will know best for you what's going to be a suitable outcome. So if you are capable
what I say to the jury, if for instance he is found guilty and it gets to a sentencing, I might be able to say, well, this is what I would be open to accepting. The loss of my boat, I get a new boat, I get a new trailer. This fella says he's a builder. Well, within a certain time frame, I expect to have all my property rebuilt, and I don't expect it to cost me anything. Obviously, if he didn't finalise the commitment given in the court, within the due time frame, there might need to be a second appearance where something else happens, and like you say, the sovereign fund might come into play, where the sovereign fund effect pays for all my damages and a new boat, but the individual who created all of those problems has their sovereign wealth fund tapped.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it's one of those. It all depends on whether the judgment from the jury was deemed guilty or not guilty for the malicious intent.
Sure.
That's kind of the centerpiece of it. And if that's not established, that there was malicious intent, then there's no dipping into their sovereign wealth fund. Does that sort of make sense? If it was like an act of desperation. But if it can be established that there was malicious intent, then then they need to, compensate out of their own fund. But that sovereign wealth fund is a collective thing. It's not exclusive to anyone as well. So it's a universal thing. Sort of like how we all pay tax when we go to the petrol pump, for example. A lot of money is accumulated that way. Will there be a way by which money would be accumulated and be held for these sort of purposes?
Yes. You mentioned tax. We will, in another episode, talk about tax and how legal tax is, how lawful tax is, and how you don't pay taxes. I'm getting a lot of flack from trolls at the moment about just that very point, from others speaking about it, nothing to do with what we're doing. But there really is, it should be known that there is a way, and the future doesn't necessarily have anything to do with paying tax. It has more to do with being socially responsible. Is that a fair way of describing what should be ahead of what we're doing?
Like taxes is just stealing. It's legalized stealing. That's pretty much it. So that's all it's ever been. If we actually want to live in an equitable system, there'll be no taxing of your labor, because your labor is the only thing that you actually own that's yours. And so you're putting it in to get some kind of remuneration out. So then the fact that someone else gets to decide that they're going to take your labor from you through that remunerative process, that is stealing. It's just straightforward stealing. And you can't, that's not a system of equity.
It's a chat for another episode, because it's quite deep, and there are many arguments that I could throw up against that, to say, well, roads have to be built, hospitals have to be funded, but we'll get to those arguments. Let's get to the next trial, a civil trial, a divorce trial. Everybody's familiar with this. Now, one partner wants to take the kids interstate because they've got a new lover who happens to live 2,500 kilometres away. There hasn't been a domestic violence history in the family. The partner has no regular access to the kids If they are moved interstate at the moment, they may have, once a fortnight or once monthly sort of access. The costs incurred by the person who needs to go and see the children are either fly the children to them or get them to them in some way, or get himself to where the children are. Extra costs involved there that usually are not taken into account when it comes to child support. And of course, an understanding that everybody has the right to be happy. So how do we find an equitable solution in a civil way, in a civil trial? Oh, looks like we might have lost Fitz. Let me just jump out of my little presentation here for a minute and get into the room so I can actually see.
Yeah, that's a really hairy one, because that malicious intent. I probably just keep talking.
Yeah, you keep going.
So malicious intent is not so easy to establish here. If it was established that the one who wants to leave was doing it to harm the children, or the father through harming the children, then that's an easy one to establish. That's not always that easy to establish. So those sort of things might have to come up, on one side, as far as because that can happen. There are people out there who will use the children to get to their partner. That's not an unknown thing. So that needs to be established first, whether that's part of the motive or not. If it's not, then it comes down to equity. Like what's an equitable way to resolve someone wanting to, live in a different state where the other parent won't get access to their children. So you don't want to impinge on their life choices. Yet, as a parent, you are still responsible for the quality of life of your children. So, is that going to improve their quality of life if the distance between the two parents increases? How does that improve the quality of their life? So, these are the factors that need to be thought about deeply, and each jury member will need to put themselves in the position of, the children as well as each of the parents, and how would they want to resolve something like that? So, this comes down to them. So the thing about trial by jury is they still get a chance to resolve their differences before they come to trial. It's the same thing as they have now, like in a mediation thing. So we're assuming that hasn't been resolved before it's come to trial. And so that's why they require the jury to be the mediator for them. And so the bottom line is we don't want to penalize anyone. We want to restore an equitable outcome. So it would be up to the jury to try and work out, well, what's an equitable outcome if one of the parents wants to leave the state, and how can they do a sharing arrangement if the two can't decide on, with themselves, of what kind of sharing arrangement there would be. But the bottom line is, the way we run right now is that the female, all she needs to do, she wants to have absolute control. She just needs to make a claim without any evidence that the husband is violent, right? And then it comes under the Family Violence Act. And then all the rights of the male just goes away. They run under the corpus juris system, which means guilty till proven innocent. That's the system we run at now. And so any claim the female makes, she doesn't need to provide any evidence of. That's just taken as a statement in fact without any requirement of evidence. And in 2010, I'm pretty sure Julia Gillard's government, they passed legislation that said the female cannot be perjured for any statement she makes under the Family Violence Act. So they've got double protection. So that's what we're running now. So, we see how that works out, right? That just destroys families. So, the jury's thinking, how can we preserve the quality and the integrity of this family unit? Is this going to be the best outcome if the mum can just, if it's the mum, for example, she just takes them away and the father just doesn't get to see them, and the mother decides when the father's going to see them. That's not an equitable outcome. So, if they can't come to an agreement themselves, then the jury's going to need to try and work out what they see as an equitable solution to, making sure that the quality of the life of everyone is the best that they can create with what the limits they have in front of them.
Yeah. And there is always a solution. It just, it's a matter of a bit of give and take on both sides, I think. At the moment, the trial or the way that the jury system works or the court system works, in the family court system at least, there doesn't seem to be any fairness. It just seems to be railroaded. And I think there are, as we've discussed privately before, I think there are a lot of other reasons for that. behind the system. All right, let's move on and have a look at a corporate trial. So I've sort of picked some pictures here to go along with this from a couple of the big oil spills over the years. Now, bear in mind, we're keeping in mind the 4 pillars: create no loss, do no harm, keep the peace, commit no fraud. Now, an oil rig or a ship disaster creates just a mess of untold proportions: death of sea life, bird life, the ruining of businesses, particularly for fishing industries and that sort of thing. We've seen it in various places. The images I'm going to be showing up here while we're talking about it come from the Exxon Valdez and the Event Horizon rig fires at that, really decimated Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico a few years ago. And as you can see, they do create a hell of a mess. Now, Fitz, finding who is responsible is a big ask in a case like this, isn't it?
Well, the way it usually works is that you go to the top of the chain, because
So that would be the owner of the company?
Yes, so they would have an organizational structure in place.
Yeah, so
And
no singular person, a board of people.
yes, and so they can all be brought before the jury in their private and unlimited capacity. Because see, the way common law works is there's no legal protection, there's no legislative protection. There is a living being who is in charge of making decisions. So they are accountable as a man or a woman who has made that decision. So then it's a matter of getting evidence, collecting evidence from every single member in the chain of command as to what their role is, as to what instructions they're following. Because you see, there's a really important statement that the jury needs to understand and that is, who bears the greater burden of responsibility? The one who gives the orders or the one who carries them out and follows them through? Because see, each and every one of us has a conscience. And it's when we choose to sidestep our conscience to do our job, that's when you get brought before the court, right? So there is going to be so many people who have taken orders, right? And they've acted out of conscience.
I accept that. But in the instance we're talking about here, the board is in charge of finding places to go drill and making sure the infrastructure is there for the drillers to find the oil and for the oil to get carted off. I doubt the board has any influence over the shipping routes that are chosen, other than they are the shortest possible so that they maximize profits and don't lose money with fuel. The bloke who is captain of the ship, if you like, ultimately responsible for where the ship is going, is asleep, and he's got a yeoman or a deck watchman commanding the bridge. These days, usually driven by autopilot. They're merely there just to watch where the ship is going. Obviously, something has gone wrong with either the autopilot system or the bloke standing at the wheel, and they've driven into something very hard and torn themselves open, in the case of the Exxon Valdez, or in the case of what happened with the Event Horizon rig platform. They had a blowout of a form that maybe could have been prevented with better maintenance schedules and all that sort of thing. I think only discovered further down the track. I say that with hindsight. So how do we make the board responsible for a bloke who was standing at the wheel at 2 o'clock in the morning and hit a rock he should have known was there but didn't?
Well, it's not so much that straightforward. It's not really that straightforward, you see, because the whole system we live under is no loss, right? So if a board is making decisions to maximize profits, well, there's usually a loss involved in that as well. Something has to lose in order to gain a profit. So it's not so straightforward as that one event. That could be a sequence of choices they've made before this even occurred. That could be the reason. Like if you think about Boeing, right? Boeing's reputation is shocking because they've been cutting corners in their safety. So that wasn't just a one overnight decision. That's been a long-term plan. So we don't know this as to what decisions have been made as to why it would have led to this down the track. This could have been, years in the making of decisions after decisions, that were made by the board if they were trying to maximize profits. Because if you maximize profits, you've got to lose somewhere.
So clearly, we are failing the do no harm, do no damage sort of tenets the pillars that we're referring to. Once again, does it come down to a personal level? Do we get the guy who was at the helm? Do we get the captain who was asleep after a 12-hour watch of his own? Do we get the board? And at the end of the day, who pays for the cleanup? What happens? I mean, clearly there is loss. There is a huge amount of loss for wildlife. Natural stuff, natural loss is what I'm getting at, rather than opposed to corporate or business losses. But there would be those as well. Fisheries were ruined. Entire fisheries were ruined. So a lot of people lose in this scenario. I've got to say, Alaska, where the Exxon Valdez disaster happened, I think mostly happened around national parks, but it was all along their pristine coastline, which is where all the tourists go during the cruise season. So there was clearly loss there as well. How do you find an equitable solution for such a massive disaster?
Yeah, look, it's a bit of cart before the horse, you see, because if we had a trial by jury system in place, right, most of these disasters wouldn't be happening, because everyone would be too afraid to cut corners and maximize their profits, because they know to do that would mean that at some point there's going to be a disaster. So it's a kind of hard one to do, the way the system is right now, because you see what a corporation is. It's two words. It comes from the word corpse and orate, and that means dead, speaking dead. Now, if you're speaking dead, you're soulless, right? You are spiritually impoverished. And if you're spiritually impoverished, that means you have no integrity. And so a body that has no integrity has no intention to ever do anything that is to preserve the quality of anyone's life. You see, so that in itself, right, that whole corporate structure is already a big problem, because whoever created the corporate structure had deliberate intention to harvest and plunder. Because that's why they created the limited liability structure. Because if they never did have that intention, they never would have created a limited liability structure. It's just that simple. So it's not a straightforward thing to be able to answer based on, just shoving someone into a trial by jury. Because if we had it from the beginning, we wouldn't have corporations, because they are lacking integrity. So we would have just small mom and pop sort of businesses, and like the connect collections of that. We wouldn't be doing all this exporting. We'd all be making stuff locally. It'd be an entirely different structure. So we probably wouldn't be running off oil for starters. We'd be doing different kinds of energy usages that don't require us to drag stuff out of the ground. So this is a really difficult one to answer.
That leads me to another question then, because we know that there are about 6,000 technology patents that have been hidden from us. These are everything from propulsion, electromagnetic, through to, well, some pretty exotic sort of patents that going to blow your mind when they get released, really. So with those patents being held back, they're owned by some of these big energy companies, specifically being buried so that they can keep producing oil, tearing it out of the north, tearing it out of the middle of the ocean. Will that come into the deliberations of trial by jury in something like this going forward?
For sure, it has to. I mean, it can't be avoided, because that's a deprivation of our liberties right there. If we can live in a way that's clean, that does not destroy our environment, the very environment we're dependent on for our quality of life, then of course that has to be brought forward. That can't be ignored. So yeah, absolutely. This is where the power of the trial by jury is. They can't be stopped by government, because we created government. Government is in the way of us getting an equitable outcome. That's the purpose they serve. But we, the people, would never deprive ourselves of an equitable outcome. Why would we do that? That just stands in the face.
One of our current viewers has just popped up a solution, geoenergy. Now, I was lucky enough to work, well, I didn't work with him. I was a driver. So I drove this fellow around. He owned a geo company. There are not a lot of solutions for geothermal production of energy or power here in Australia, because we have a very stable geothermic base. We have a few hot springs, but we don't really have, unlike New Zealand, something that you can really tap into, or unlike Greenland, that you can really tap into. I'm sure there are nations around the Pacific Rim that would be able to make very good use of geothermal technology. But once again, that technology is being suppressed. It's not made easy. And who knows, some of these 6,000 patents that are being hidden from us may relate quite significantly to geothermal engineering. That doesn't mean that Australia can't partake of that. It just means we haven't gone deep enough yet. So there is some possibilities maybe with that in the future. I've got to say, from my limited understanding of how it works, it is a brilliant technology, and of course free, and at this point in time endless at any rate. So well worth exploring. So Fitz, the corporate structure, with the explanations that we've had so far, it feels to me like, and this is using my current mindset. I'm trying to put myself into the position of some of our viewers. It feels to me like this could be stretched out in a court for years and years and years, appeal after appeal after appeal, and at the end of the day, anybody who was affected died a long time ago by the time we get a solution. Was that going to happen under trial by jury?
No, absolutely not. There's no such thing as appeals. When the jury makes its decision, because it's us acting out of conscience, so we're using the highest level of capacity that exists in us. There's no coming back, and because that's all just a way to keep the whole thing stretched out and more money to be made by the Bar Society. That's all that is. So because in trial by jury, there's no exchange of money, because Article 40 of the 1215 Magna Carta actually states that to no one shall we delay, deny, or I think it was charge or some version like that, the right to justice. So it's not a paid affair. Justice has got nothing to do with money. Like the two can't have anything to do with each other. So if anyone who's coming to a court of justice, not these corporate courts, there's no venal motive to keep anything going. We just want a resolution so we can return to being whole again. That's all. That's the whole point. So you can't drag, stuff doesn't drag out. There's a very quick way it gets done. We just need to have all the facts on the table, and then the jury decides on, how they can see the whole thing fitting together and who played what part, because when you're still doing your job, you still have a conscience. So everyone has a role in the choices they make, because we are all born with that capacity, no matter what our job is, to know what our choices are, if they're coming from a place of deep understanding, of giving from the heart, or if there's something we're doing just for what we want. And when we want something versus to what we're willing to do, that's a low end of our consciousness. That's not us being in a higher ascended end. That's a low end. That's a suppression. That's our ego suppressing our intelligence. And every time that happens, you will get some form of violation without fail. And so then we decide, is that the world we want to live in? Do we want to keep living in a way where our ego keeps suppressing our consciousness and we keep violating one another? Or do we want to show an example of, the world we want to live in, and that is that we are always open to our conscience being our first and final guiding compass as to the choices we make. And if that system is in play, half of these things would even be happening, because that's just the system and the conditions we'd be living under, and that would just feel very natural, because it is. But we live in a very unnatural state, so we're coming from that place of there's a legal structure that justifies why we have transgressions in natural law. That legal system was designed to actually make sure that we override our consciousness, that we use our ego to suppress it, because that's the conditions for us to survive are required. We require that for us to do so.
It's a very involved, it sounds like a very involved problem, but what you've just outlined just reiterates the fact that with a little bit of training and understanding, people will be able to act correctly as arbiters in trial by jury, be able to make decisions themselves, which are feeling natural and right. All we need to do is get education up. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Like this is not really new knowledge in the sense of knowing when we're acting out of service to others and when we act in the service of just ourselves. Like, anything that's just going to be what I want versus what I will. Most of us know that because our feelings tell us when we've acted in the service of others because we feel amazing, and when we've just done something for ourselves. It's a very short-lived high that you get when you've done something just for yourself, where if it's acting in the service of others, it's prolonged and it lasts. And so if we're attached to that part of our consciousness, that it's just a matter of us, having that conditions put out in front of us so we can actually have a lived experience of what that's like. And because we don't have a lived experience of what that's like, some of the things I'm saying might sound foreign to a lot of people right now. So it does require a little bit of conceptualization. And just thinking about whenever whoever's listening now has ever given from their heart to give to someone else's well-being, how they felt. Just sort of tap into that part. Well, that's the system of equity right there. And that's what the trial by jury is there to do, is to reestablish that balance when something's been knocked out of balance.
Mate, it sounds very deep and involved, but I can tell from personal experience, my very personal experience, that once the penny drops, it's very easy to see what we're talking about in every day, isn't it? And how what we're talking about can make real differences peacefully. And that's the key here. Trial by jury is the peaceful solution to the corruption issues of today.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to say is, like, I hear a lot of people talk about the 1215 Magna Carta as being some relic that's got nothing to do with how we live our lives today, because it was written, so long ago at a time when they had feudalism, etc. But what I did want to just bring up, I know it might sound a bit unrelated right now. However, if you think about everyone here who's fighting for the freedom of and liberating ourselves from this current tyranny, like, if you were to ask them, I'd be willing to bet that they're doing it not just for their children, but their children's children and so forth, and future generations. So what happened back in 1215 was exactly the same thing.
Yeah, right.
They came from exactly the same place. They wanted to secure that not only for their children, but their children's children and future generations. So they enshrined it so we could use it. The only difference is we don't know about it, so we don't know how to use it. That's the only thing that's missing. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's already there for us. We just need to utilize it.
And the way that they hit it, the way that they hit it was very easy, because in 1215, the only way to spread the message from the king, if you like, was to write out a proclamation, not have it printed, but handwrite, and then nail that up on a tree or on the side of an inn all over the kingdom, and then hope that the people who walked past it were able to read and understand it, or that there was somebody in that town who could explain it to people and see how it worked. Now, you also have to understand that in that time, there really was only one power that could rival the king in any way, shape, or form, and that was the church. Every king had their archbishop advisor, and every archbishop had a network of priests spread out throughout the country in local churches. Communications of the day were communicated through the church, more so than nailing a piece of parchment up on an inn wall, because people would turn to church. And of course, they would listen to the bloke standing in the pulpit delivering the message. So the subversion of 1215 began the day after it was signed. And of course, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, who were the predominant religious deities of the time, and certainly the largest in the world still today, they had complete control of imparting this message. And once I think Rome had got a hold of it and had a good look at what Magna Carta 1215 enshrined, they knew they couldn't let it go. So, of course, they made an attempt in 1216. They made another one in the 1220s. I think another one in the 1260s. And, of course, the version that everybody now believes is real was written in 1297. Now, Magna Carta 1297 has to be a fraud. And Fitz, would you like me to explain why I think it's a fraud?
Yeah, I'd love you to. Please go ahead.
So I have a nice little way of putting this, folks. So let's understand that Magna Carta 1215 was written by and for the people of the British Empire. It was brought to King John, a king of the British Empire, by the barons of the British Empire, some 25 of them. Now, the barons held the power because they had the armies, they held the lands. The king was elected to the position of sovereign, and his job was to, well, make sure that the people's rights were protected. Unfortunately, nothing had been written down and corporatized, if you like, at the time. And King John was an absolute bastard. So, rotten person, they gave him the choice, sign this or don't be king anymore. He signed it, away it went. Now, if you can explain to me with any reasonable, justifiable argument how a Catholic Pope in Italy was able to rewrite Magna Carta 1215, take out some very, very specific mechanisms placed in 1215 for the people, specifically Article 61, which is the People's Security Clause. That's gone. That's disappeared. You won't find anything like that in Magna Carta 1297 and a couple of other very significant pieces. So if you can explain to me how a Catholic priest who wasn't elected to the position by the people, he was elected to that position by a shady small group of men dressed in black smocks and who've had some serious queries put over their behavior around young men and women. And then they, in turn, were elected to their positions in the Great Court in Rome by a larger, broader group of shady little men in black smocks who used to preach to you every Sunday at Mass. Now, how do the Catholic Church get to rewrite a British Empire document for and behalf of the English Empire and people? It just simply can't happen. Constitutions are written by people, not institutions. That's why the Australian Constitution is a farce, because it's based on Magna Carta 1297 to begin with, which is also a fraud. But, well, we'll get into the Commonwealth Constitutional Act another day, shall we, Fitz? But have I outlined why there can be no argument to support the truth that Magna Carta 1297 is in fact any way real at all? It is nothing more than a fiction.
No, you've done it brilliantly. I mean, the only thing I would add to that is another way to explain it. It's like, imagine if you're married and you've taken some vows, and then just some random guy just shows up into your house. You've never met them before, and they said, you know what? I've just appointed myself as being the executor of your wedding, and now I'm going to take out certain clauses of your vows, right? And I'm annulling them. Yeah. Now, who would allow someone to walk into their house and go, oh, fair enough, never met you before, but you sound like you've got some authority, so I'll just do what you tell me. That's pretty much, if you run that 1297 argument, you're pretty much saying that anyone can show up your property and just change your arrangement with your intimate partner. Like, that's what you're saying. So that's another way that I like to put it. And the Latin term for that is acting ultra vires, which means outside the grant of authority one has. And that's what the Pope was doing.
Very much so, operating outside that grant. And that's the message we need to get across to the people. That is why Magna Carta 1297 is not a legal document. And any argument you base going forward off that document can't win. And I'll tell you why it can't win. Because when the Pope installed Magna Carta 1297, he also installed, or helped to install, another control over you, a control called the legal system. Because if they were going to replace trial by jury, they had to replace it with something. And they replaced it with jury trial. And that meant they had to put a judge, head of the corporation, on the bench. They had to put representatives of the corporation on both sides of the argument. That's where your prosecutorial and defense lawyers come from. The legal was inserted around this time and going forward, and just got stronger and stronger and stronger, to where today it is one of the strongest bands that binds us to the slavery we are in today.
Yeah, so I just did want to add, like in 1215, I'm not sure how many people know this, but the Bar Association was created immediately after the 1215 Magna Carta was sealed. So is that a coincidence?
Explain what BAR stands for, can you?
British Accreditation Registry. So that's just a private society, right? That was run by Rome. It's a Roman invention. They take an oath to Rome. So they were created. So that pretty much tells you a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the other side of it is that when it comes to, the whole CESTA-KV trust, that's what these courts are now. They're CQV hearings. So that's that certificate that you get registered to when you're born, the birth certificate. They create a trust and a bond. And that's what they're dealing with when you're in those courtrooms. They're nothing to do with a living being. They're all to do with a paper fiction. So it's an actual corporate hearing that's all conducted on paper. None of it's actually anything to do with what exists in nature. And we are natural beings. So that's not even the environment we exist in, and we're being prosecuted through that. Like, that is the actual definition of human trafficking, to do that. Absolutely. That's constructive fraud. And that's what the Bar Society is there to do. It's nothing to do with liberty. That's why we all come out of those courts feeling ripped off, because that's what the purpose is to rip us off, and take our liberties from us. and harvest us as good debt slaves.
Fitz, I think it's been a pretty interesting show so far. We've had a few people commenting. They seem to be enjoying it. And we're now getting off the initial subject and getting onto a few others. But we will have other live chats. We'd love to bring people involved. We have been speaking about Magna Carta 1215 and trial by jury. Fitz, you and I have spoken off air of the importance of educating people on becoming jury members. And we have a little bit of a plan for things we'd like to do going forward. But it has been suggested, I think, by you and others that we set up a broadcast once a week, maybe, where interested people can come, sit, learn about this and put themselves in the position, open their mind up to becoming something of a trial by jury member, and with a view to down the track in a couple of months after we've done a few lessons, we might start doing some of these trial by jury arguments using real people.
Yeah, I can really see the value in that, because until people actually have a felt, lived experience of what it's actually like to operate a system of equity, that all they're left with is what they know, and what they know is what they've been shown, and that ends up constructing their reality. And it's really hard for the everyday man who's living and woman who's living in a system that represses their consciousness to actually expand out of it. So it is a necessary requirement to create an experience that they won't get anywhere else, so they can truly have it inside their body. So it's no longer just words, it's actually a lived experience. So yeah, I agree, it's quite essential. And so anyone who's willing to investigate and open up their consciousness, they're always welcome here.
Yep, absolutely. So you can make contact through us to us here at the website, or you can contact me on Facebook. I'm pretty easy to find. And we will make sure that you're invited to the first of those, which we hope to set up in the not too distant future. Fitzroy Sterling, once again, another very entertaining hour sitting with you and learning about trial by jury today. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure, my friend. I can't wait for the next edition.
All right, well, we'll get that underway real soon. Thanks again, mate. Look after yourself.
Likewise.